the end of October 1942, the city on the Volga still has not fallen. The Führer announces to the German people, "We have taken Stalingrad. A few pockets of resistance remain. We will take them one by one. It is just a question of time." For Hitler, Stalingrad has come to represent his victory over Russia. After 2 years of fighting in Russia, the Germans have threatened to vanquish the Eastern Giant. In the north, Leningrad is surrounded by the Germans. It has been a year since the Germans entered this northern city. In the center, Moscow, the target city, remains just within reach for the Germans. In the south, the drive towards the Baku oil fields has come to a halt in the Caucasus Mountains. In Stalingrad, the Soviets are holding their ground. Contrary to Hitler's declarations, Soviet boats continue to cross the Volga, bringing over reinforcements. Every day, thousands of young Russian men, sometimes without any weapons or military training, are disembarked on the riverbanks. Those who back away from the German bullets are ruthlessly executed by the political commissars. On the 7th of November, the anniversary of the revolution, the beleaguered soldiers holding Stalingrad and the Soviet troops all along the front listen to their commander-in-chief, Stalin, make this astonishing declaration. "Tomorrow there will be celebrations in our streets." And indeed, General Zhukov, the man who saved Moscow, has a plan to keep those pockets of resistance fighting to the very end, in order to retain the German troops of General Paulus inside Stalingrad. On the other side of the Volga, Zhukov is secretly putting together an entire army. The country has been ravaged, 1/4 of its territory lost. But the entire Soviet Union is toiling away to provide this new army with huge amounts of equipment. Factories that were moved out and rebuilt behind the Ural Mountains are operating 24 hours a day. In this endeavor, lives will be sacrificed. It is the winter of 1942. The women working in these unheated, sometimes ruthless workshops are cold and hungry. Many will die of exhaustion. But the country's industrial production will increase tenfold. The United States is now providing massive amounts of aid to the Soviet Union. The Allies are able to reduce the threat posed by German submarines in the North Atlantic by forming protective convoys to Soviet ports, such as Murmansk. Anti-communism is put on hold. For the Americans, Joseph Stalin is now Uncle Joe, and for the British, good old Joe. The Russians receive huge shipments of jeeps, tanks, planes and trucks, and cans of corned beef. When they open the tins of meat, the Russian soldiers joke, "We're opening the second front." Along with Stalin, everyone expects the Allies to do more to alleviate their plight. In Egypt, however, the British are being threatened by the Germans. Rommel, whom Hitler has just promoted to Field Marshal after his victories in the desert, and his tank army, the Afrika Korps, are getting dangerously close to the Suez Canal. They have reached El Alamein. The British Empire is in peril. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill comes to encourage his army in the desert. The situation is grim, but he retains his sense of humour and shares cheerful moments with his men. And yet he is just recovering from his first heart attack. He meets with the newly appointed General Montgomery. Montgomery wasn't Churchill's first choice. And all of these soldiers in the desert are a little worried. The British, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the South Africans, and the Free French. As soon as he arrived, Montgomery, the son of a clergyman, ordered a new program of strict rules and discipline to be imposed. He is cautious. He waits until his army is superior in terms of both men and equipment. The new American Sherman tanks, for example, built for speed and power. Montgomery launches his offensive with a preliminary artillery barrage, followed by a massive tank assault. But the German 88 flak guns caused tremendous losses. Rommel's soldiers counterattack relentlessly. The battle turns into a bayonet charge, just like in the Battle of the Somme in 1916, with heavy casualties on both sides. In this deadly game, it is the side with the most men that wins. In a letter to his wife, Rommel writes, "We're simply being crushed by the enemy's weight." He receives a message from Hitler. There can be no other thought than to stand fast, yield not a yard of ground. Rommel writes back to his wife, "I rack my brains for a way out of this plight for my poor troops. We are facing perhaps the most difficult days that a man can undergo." And he adds, "The dead are lucky. It's all over for them." Rommel retreats. In London, Churchill announces to his fellow citizens what is really the first good news of the war.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Churchill's words ring out around the world. The old British lion has stood up to Hitler. Back in his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler is scornful. He says, "It is just a setback. The war will go on." And indeed it does. The Allies open up a new front in North Africa, a first step towards controlling the Mediterranean. As in 1917, American troops sail across the Atlantic. The French writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who was exiled in New York, will return from the US with one of these military convoys. The author of The Little Prince writes, "Friends in America, I'd like to do you complete justice. 50,000 soldiers were going to war not for the United States, but for humanity, for human respect, for human freedom, and human greatness." Off the coast of Casablanca and Oran, the British and Americans are greeted with cannon fire from the Vichy French. They counterattack. North Africa is still controlled by the Vichy regime, which collaborates with the Germans.